thing on. Can you hear me? Yes?
Okay. Well, thank you everyone for staying and not leaving early to go to lunch. Is there a lot of echo? Is that just in my mind because of jet lag? My name is Kyle Ott. This is my colleague Rachel Teicher. I'm a data analyst at the National Network for Safe Communities, which is an action research center at the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which is the City University of New York in New York City, and we will explain a little bit more about what all that means and what we do. My colleague Rachel is the director of our Intimate Partner Violence Intervention work, and today we're talking about what is the National Network, how do we operate, also, what is the Intimate Partner Violence Intervention, and give you a little example of what we're thinking about in terms of data. And also want to recognize that we are going to be a little bit different than many of the other presentations here. I need the clicker, I realized. Great. So, you might know our leader, our boss, David Kennedy. He is a noted criminologist, and the National Network for Safe Community is his shop in New York City. We have been in existence for about 10 years, and David is most known for his work around group violence, or a lot of other places will call it gangs, but we force the term group. So we have a group violence intervention, which we won't talk about today, but is well known and has been well researched and evaluated in the US. And also, we are increasingly thinking about how to adopt our different strategies in an international context. Rachel will cover what IPVI means, so I won't even go about that. And before we continue, I'd just like to thank you all for letting us be here at the conference. Specifically, want to thank Dr. Garner Clancy and the AIC who have invited us to Australia for about 10 days. So we just got here the other day. Also wanted to make a note and a shameless plug that we will have about an hour and a half presentation at the University of Sydney Law School on Wednesday to talk in more detail about what IPVI is, because it's really hard to do it in a very short time.
You'll click for me?
Yes, I will click for you.
Fantastic. Hi, everyone. So just to tell you a little bit about the NNSC, we are an action research center, and we refer to ourselves internally as pracademics. So other than David, we are not the traditional academics or researchers. We are a combination of lawyers and analysts and policy specialists and researchers who work directly with the people on the ground in any given city who are directly involved in public safety and criminal justice. And so for us, we're a little bit of that practitioner piece without having those hands-on exactly on the ground, and a little bit of the research piece, because data, both quantitative and qualitative, is so key to us being able to identify the dynamics at play in any particular city and tailor the strategies to be as effective and sustainable as possible. And this is just a brief overview of the principles of our organization and the perspective we have when we come to any city or any individual to talk about what violence reduction and violence prevention and public safety means to us. And do no harm can be a bit confusing because we know that inevitably harm might happen. But for us, it's a reminder about unintended harm and the unintended consequences that can come when even the most well-intended criminal justice actors are working together to solve a problem, and being mindful of how that harm could take different forms. And for us, we also feel that it's essential when you think about public safety to think about community. And the community isn't a monolith. I might talk about it today like it is, but having buy-in and support from the community to engage alongside with law enforcement is really key, again, to sustaining any positive change around violence reduction and public safety. Everyone has to be in it together, because if it's something that we could arrest our way out of, or prosecute our way out of, or incarcerate our way out of, we would have done it already, and we wouldn't be facing some of the issues we're still tackling today. We also believe in getting deterrence right and using enforcement strategically. So sometimes our law enforcement partners are less than thrilled to hear that because, Americans, they want to go in guns a-blazing, lots of force. And the idea is that you shouldn't have to. First of all, if you need to come after someone, they should know. They should know why, and they should know that you're coming. And you should be thoughtful and strategic about it. So use an anvil and not a scalpel, because criminal justice is very strong medicine, and the right dose might get you the outcome that makes sense, both for the perpetrator and the victim, but the wrong dose could actually make people very sick. So the way we approach our work, and I think this is why Kyle referenced at the beginning how we're a little bit different, is we're not evaluating work. We are using the data and the research to help implement the strategies on the ground, and others evaluate the success of the work. For us, when we think about research, it's all about understanding the dynamics with our partners and in that jurisdiction. And particularly with something like intimate partner violence, where there's so much inconsistency around definitions and statutes and procedures, it's so important to learn from the experts that are doing the work every single day in our cities. And we provide a lot of hands-on advising between site visits, regular advising calls, building with those partners what we talk about as a coalition of the willing. And those are the folks who are going to help drive implementation of any strategy. We work with all of them to ensure that the framework is applied, and it's applied with fidelity to the model, but it's not cookie cutter. It can't be one size fits all, because as we've come to see, one size fits all doesn't actually work for the majority of situations. And we think about our work from the perspective of having a theory of change, that we pick a problem. And in the case of the intimate partner violence intervention, it was David thinking for a long time about how everyone said that domestic violence or intimate partner violence was a different kind of crime, and that the offenders were different types of offenders. And as someone who did a good deal of advocacy work in what feels like my much younger years, I remember being in school and hearing about that and being discussed, are perpetrators of domestic violence just specialists? Do they only hurt their partner? And in the rest of their world, they're good people, right? And they don't commit any other crimes. And what David came to see is that even with intimate partner violence, the most serious and significant incidents, near fatal or fatal, are being driven by a small number of individuals. And those individuals are actually very prolific in their offending. They're not just offending through acts of intimate partner violence. They're what we call cafeteria-style offenders. So we focus on a problem. We get that coalition of the willing. So that will be the cops and the sheriffs and the prosecutors and probation officers, corrections officers, social workers, advocates. And we work with them to unpack what their problem is. Part of that is where the data comes in. So we're going to talk about the quantitative data pretty significantly, and by we, I mean Kyle, but the qualitative data is essential. We really need to understand the flavor and the context of what a practitioner's experience is with intimate partner violence. And then we apply the strategy. And in applying the strategy, we create new facts on the ground, meaning we see impacts, we see change. And as we do this, and we talk about it with our partners on the ground, is this being a little bit iterative, and not unlike having to build a car while you drive it, which they don't really like. Everything starts to change, right? And as things are changing, we continue to respond to the ways in which the crime and public safety is changing on the ground. So we haven't included a lot about intimate partner violence generally because I imagine that most everyone here is familiar with intimate partner violence being both a serious crime, a serious public health issue, often a crippling economic issue, one of social welfare, and one that the criminal justice system takes very, very seriously. And in fact, the criminal justice system taking it so seriously kind of signaled a shift from years of advocates talking about how this was something that needed to come out from behind closed doors. And so prevalence is all relative. We know that it's underreported regardless of whether you're in New South Wales or you're in Detroit. We know that for a lot of reasons, victim survivors are afraid of engaging with law enforcement, and we know that law enforcement has very serious concerns around safety when responding to these call-outs. So a little bit about IPVI, the Intimate Partner Violence Intervention. It was piloted in High Point, North Carolina, and the idea behind it was really twofold, that traditional criminal justice practices can place an undue burden on a victim survivor to somehow impact or change the situation while leaving the offender relatively unaddressed. Those dominant practices, while very well intended, are also leaving offenders unaccountable. There can be treatment, there can be some attempts at behavior modification or sanctioning them, but there really hasn't been an effective way to stop intimate partner violence offending. We also wanted to see how you could actually tease out the different types of offending and not see it as one size fits all, but see it as a continuum and be able to address intimate partner violence from the lowest level where an officer suspects that there might be something going on in the home, but doesn't have enough to make a report or to make an arrest, all the way to something that is near fatal or fatal. We do this starting with the data, right? So we do a lot of data collection exercises. Some of them involve rooms like this full of people with us asking them questions and asking them to teach us about how they do what they do so we can understand the way they work together and what intimate partner violence is like from their perspective as a practitioner. We use that in combination with the quantitative data to understand what is the difference between someone who is a high-level serious offender or a chronic offender and a low-level offender, and how does that look different? So in some of our jurisdictions, a chronic offender is someone who has 3 or more incidents to their name, not even arrests, just 3 or more incidents. And in other jurisdictions, for them, 7 or 8 incidents is when they finally start to pay attention to someone as being chronic. We work with them to create a criteria for each of these levels or tiers, and every level corresponds for both victim survivors and offenders. And law enforcement and advocates engage in verbal messaging and written messaging at every level to both perpetrators and victims to explain the strategy, to explain risks that the offender might face should he or she choose to offend again, and communicate offers of help to both individuals. If an offender chooses to reoffend, despite knowing what their legal risks are, they are elevated to a higher category, and there's an appropriate messaging and response. And this is just a sample of what an offending category could look like. So you would look at the full range of the dynamic in that jurisdiction, right, and work with them to come up with a criteria that both reflects the laws and the practices and the flavor of the jurisdiction, but also reflects the data, right? Because this is something that has to provide just enough room for practitioner gut check and expertise, but also be stringent enough that it stands up and doesn't seem as though it's arbitrary. And in order to do this, we have to get a lot of data. And what we sometimes find is that the data we get, the hard, raw data, the numbers, doesn't match the data that we're being given by the people that are sitting in front of us and telling us their experience. And so we realized in trying to implement this that we were finding ourselves struggling to bridge that gap between the data that we know exists, but we can't tease out of record management systems, and the truth of what these practitioners are telling us. So a lot like the X-Files, we knew the truth was out there, and we just had to come up with some really clever ways of finding it.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So what Rachel is saying, more or less, oh, well, sorry about that. Okay, I'm not controlling my mic, but I will be speaking now. I'm back. God, I'm still recovering from that X-Files reference. So what Rachel is really saying is, in the US, essentially no one that we work with for sure, no one that we're talking to, or any city that we've come across, codes intimate partner violence as a cross-cutting crime. From what I understand, here, y'all are really light years ahead of how we operate in the US. So the number one thing that we really want to understand is how much intimate partner violence is going on in a given community where we think we might do the intimate partner violence intervention. And of course, these communities self-select and come to us and say, hey, I think we have an intimate partner violence problem. And then I'll ask, okay, well, what does it look like, right? What do your systems say? What kind of data are you collecting? And how can we match what the practitioners are telling us versus what's in the system, also acknowledging that much of the violence is potentially going underreported. I also always like to have a note here at the bottom. Rachel and I spoke at the University of Chicago at a computer science conference, and we were the only presenters that did not talk about any type of prediction going forward. And we got people that stood up and clapped, but we're not computer scientists or data scientists, so I just want to say quite clearly that we're not interested in any kind of predictive policing. So I want to make that distinction clear as we move on. So these are the questions that we really want to sink our teeth in as we're working with the jurisdiction to get the intimate partner violence off the ground, right? So why are the levels really important, right? How much of the crime is connected to intimate partners, right? All the way down from a non-crime family disturbance call all the way up to murder charges and everything in between, right? We specifically want to look at how many non-crime calls for service or call-outs, as you call them here, are occurring in a community, because those people would be part of the intervention going forward, right? They would get the same kind of messaging that Rachel was talking about. So we want to understand how many individuals are there, and also unpack, how does the violence escalate if it does, and what does that really look like? And importantly for the intervention, we want to understand whether these offenders we're talking about are specializing in IPV. We don't find that anywhere, so we find that they are generalists. If it looks like they specialized or it came out of the blue, most often there was some type of other history, maybe outside of the state lines or in a different country, or the family around them all knew, and somehow it just didn't make its way to the right people to find out before a homicide happened. Another important question, which is pretty vague, is does the frontline law enforcement, so this is patrol officers, any other types of units in police or other criminal justice actors, do they know these individuals? That's really important that we can have a frank discussion. Hey, tell me what you know about Kyle. Is Kyle familiar? What kind of offender is he? What kind of history does he have? Really kind of unpacking and challenging this kind of qualitative information is really important for building out the intervention. So I'm going to talk briefly about an example city that we're working in. Maybe y'all have been to New Orleans for ASC. Just an hour up the river is the second largest city in Louisiana. That's Baton Rouge. Population of about 500,000. They average about 10 IPV homicides annually, and that has been increasing over time. They have a lot of different issues going on in the community. And they have thousands of calls for service. I actually wanted to grab the latest numbers that they had, but their server was down, so I was not able to grab those yesterday or today. But I would say it's about 10,000 calls for service annually. There are multiple law enforcement agencies acting in the parish, which makes things even more complicated. There are a couple of large universities in Baton Rouge. But most importantly, and what I'm here to talk about is the data and what we're doing with it. So what I can tell you is, after doing this job, I've been here for about 3 years, is that in the US, crime data is just awful, right? I've never been anywhere except for well-resourced cities where what I'm given, which is the raw incident level data with all individual information, anything you could possibly imagine, I would probably have access to. You wouldn't believe the ways that people send that to me, which is terrifying. I was once on the phone and someone was talking about the data they had sent me, and it turns out that it was in the calendar invite, and I had a panic attack while on the phone. But so in Baton Rouge, one of the biggest difficulties is that officers responding and when they're filling out the reports are not answering the question, what was the relationship between the victim and the suspect? The good news is that they are trained to obviously identify that and establish that in a police report. It's just not, thank you, it's just not captured in a field that is useful. So that's really frustrating. Charges are not helpful in the US, especially when we want to look at IPV as a cross-cutting crime. In Louisiana, there's a couple of charges that are clear IPV, but anything else, you can't really get a good sense as to whether this assault or where even this attempted murder is potentially IPV. So the narrative information is where we are leveraging our data science applications. And funny enough, the way that I was able to get the narrative, totally outside of the police export data. It came from talking to this IT person at the police for 2 months, and they were able to only export the police narratives in this ridiculous HTML file. So luckily, the HTML file was structured, so we were able to put all the narratives together for a unique police report. Am I moving too close? So yeah, the long and short of it is that the police DV data, so they didn't separate DV and IPV, showed that roughly about 2% of all crime in Baton Rouge was connected to intimate partners. We knew by talking to every single person, and no matter what agency, that just was not right. That's not possible. And so we got a data set of 13,000 unique incidents covering about 2.5 years, and 35 different charges ranging from property damage to first-degree murder. Each report contained about 642 words. The max was 5,200 words. Rachel already talked about the qualitative exercises that we do. We also analyze criminal histories, and there's a lot more to it, but I'm going to continue on to the focus, which is the middle column here. So what we were presented with this text data was kind of a classic machine learning exercise where we don't have labeled data, but we have the power to label our own data, meaning we can draw a random sample, we can read the narratives, and we can train humans, which is basically training myself and other staff, to read through the narratives and answer a couple of key questions so that we can apply those insights and the labeled data. So was this incident intimate partner violence or not? To the rest of the non-labeled sample. And I can talk more in detail about the technical aspects of this, but I'm just going to continue on. So it turns out that it's really hard to answer definitively whether you think it's intimate partner violence or not based on just reading the narrative. There's almost always this gray area where the charge might be violation of order protection, and so therefore in the police report it doesn't really establish the relationship, right? Or it's this gigantic report, but somehow it's just not clear whether the two individuals had an intimate partner history or not. They seem to know each other quite well, but we can't tell from the narrative. So from a data science perspective, that makes it a little bit difficult in creating a binary yes-no variable. So we have toyed around with creating a scale Also, while doing the human review process, different members of the staff were making their own scale. So when I forced them to answer yes or no, was this IPV or not, people were writing yes, question mark, and no, question mark, and then unclear, all caps.
And so my team took a look at that.
Yes, yes. So part of what was really interesting about this exercise is that we got to really learn, not only how police reports are written, but learn intimately about what happened, right? Not just from, what was initially reported, but this data also contains any other follow-up reports, any other investigations as well. So the idea is, can we take those insights from reviewing a random sample and apply it to the rest of the 13,000 incidents? We also were really interested in looking at how different keywords might be weighted to help us better predict whether a given incident is intimate partner related just from the narrative itself. And then, of course, there is the validation component of we run these models and it gives us a score of how likely it could be intimate partner violence, and then we can re-review that and see how well is it doing, and potentially look into these keywords which we crowdsourced in our office and also looked at the literature. I've already touched on the human label process. This was the results of the human review. So we got a 3.5% sample, and surprisingly, 35% of the human review labeled the incident as intimate partner or not. That is radically different than what the kind of levels that we were looking at for other data sources. We're a little bit worried that that sample is potentially not representative, but the good thing is we are super interested only in working with the partners on the ground for the name of the intervention. We're not necessarily looking to publish this in a peer-reviewed journal, so pardon our methods. But we do want to get better, and the surprising result was that applying that human review insight and logic to the rest of the sample reveals that about 20%, depending on which model you look at, of all of those 35 charges are related to intimate partner violence, which is really striking. It was really meaningful for the partners on the ground that we were able to basically show them that in your police reports, there is definitely documentation of intimate partner violence. It's just that there is no field and no one coding this. So talking to detectives and other individuals, what they do is they flag their casebook manually with these little red stickers, and then they were able to count them in meetings that we have and say, yeah, 40% of my violent crime caseload is intimate partner related, right? That is the state of intimate partner violence data in the US. Of course, we have caveats in terms of the method and what we did. We need a bigger sample. We could do a lot of other things, but we're really interested in driving this work forward. In the future, we will document this and write about it, of course. Potentially before that, we will have a package in Python or R. I work more in R, but I understand Python is the future for those who program, to really show and illustrate how exactly, what exactly we did and why that matters, and really trying to drive that message of, at least in the US, no one is really looking at intimate partner violence as a cross-cutting crime, especially from a research perspective. So we have a lot to learn from you all. Thank you.
Great, thank you. That makes me feel like we're very fortunate here in New South Wales with the data that we have.
Yes.
So anyone got some questions before we break for lunch?
I don't know how to pick. Oh, okay.
Hi, thank you for that. It was really interesting and really different, so thank you. I'm curious about your, statement that IPV offenders are not specialists and generalists. And so I wanted to ask a question that you may not want to answer, but you may be able to anecdotally. That here in Australia, I'm not sure in the US, primary prevention initiatives to prevent violence against women are one of the kind of leading, one of the pieces of work that nationally we're working on. You're saying that really changing attitudes to prevent violence against women is not really going to be solving that issue if they're generalists. Is that would that be a fair understanding of that, of your view on that?
So I don't think, sorry. So I wouldn't look at it that way. So for us, if we're looking at being able to do prevention from a criminal justice perspective, which is something we haven't really been able to do very well, at least in the US, when it comes to intimate partner violence, we need to understand what are the ways in which someone could be deterred. And so with deterrence theory, it's looking at how could someone be held accountable? Should, let's say, the system as we know it with domestic violence charges go exactly according to plan, which is it's completely unpredictable. And so while there are always going to be individuals who get arrested and are charged and decide, you know what, I'm good. I'm not going to do this for a while. And the system as it exists acts as a natural deterrent, right? And you're always going to have those individuals that are not known to the criminal justice system. And those are often really tragic stories where, as Kyle referenced, lots of people knew what was going on, but law enforcement had no contact with them, and so they couldn't intervene, and they couldn't prevent, and they couldn't deter. It's looking at the ones that are chronic, right? The ones that continue to repeat. Now, sometimes they escalate in that classic pattern of an escalation of violence in an abusive relationship. Sometimes it's low level, but it's chronic. Either way, they're not stopping. And so creating a deterrence regime that consists of an explanation of what they're doing is wrong, why it's wrong, what the zero tolerance is for that, and that this is something that they have a choice about. This is not coming at the behest of the victim. This is the state, the criminal justice actors, those that are charged with public safety, having to do their job, right, and giving them a choice. So you can get help, you can stop on your own, but if you are rearrested, these are some of the risks you could face. And so for individuals that fall into that category of they're generalists, at a certain point when they keep reoffending, you're able to do something called pulling levers. And it's really looking at their expansive criminal offending behavior and making the connection for them. Oftentimes, with a DV case, the officer might know a lot about them, but may not know that the narcotics unit knows something about this guy as well. So this is where collaboration and law enforcement intelligence sharing comes into play, and using creative legal levers to explain to someone how even if we cannot get you on this incident or this charge or this prosecution related to your continual pattern of intimate partner violence, you are so serious to us, the safety of our community is so serious, and you being a part of our community is so serious that we want you to know we know about your criminal legal exposures, right? We know that you have a conviction for firearms. We know that you have a long history of buying and selling or breaking and entering. And oftentimes, those are easier cases to get higher sanctions or sanctions period on. And so what it really means is that more of the offenders that are chronic or high level are generalists, and that means they are open to being deterred, which means there's an opportunity to prevent future intimate partner violence through engaging with them.
I think everyone else is broken for lunch, so maybe just do one more question and then we might be able to talk one-on-one.
Sorry, just one more of a comment. Hayley Foster from the Women's Domestic Violence Court Advocacy Service, New South Wales. Just as a follow-up to that, I guess I would say, just building on from that, we're looking at the really high-risk reoffenders that are, really serious levels of violence that are could be described as generalists. But what we know is that gender-based violence is prevalent, and that 1 in 4 women experience it throughout our communities. And so it's really important that we have a really clear message. So just backing up, I guess, what you'd said there, really clear message that targeting the gender discrimination and inequality and those violence supportive attitudes, the disrespectful attitudes towards women is an incredibly strong and important part of the work that we do at a widespread level. I just wanted to back that up as well, because I just didn't want there to be any kind of misconceptions that if there's high-risk offenders that may be generalists, that's means that there's not a gender element for the widespread issue that we have in our communities.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you. Join with me for thanking our speakers, and then we'll go.